All right, so get ready because today we are diving deep into one of the most volatile and long-lasting conflicts in the world, the India-Pakistan standoff. This has been going on for over 75 years. And with nuclear weapons involved, the consequences could be felt globally. So we're going beyond just headlines today. Using a report from the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, you shared that with us, to really try to understand all the little details that we might not get from just reading a news blurb. And by the end of this deep dive, whether you're prepping for a big presentation or you're just super interested in geopolitics, you're going to have a solid understanding of the India-Pakistan conflict and really how globally significant it is.
And I think what makes this conflict so interesting is it's so much more than just a border dispute.
Yeah.
It's history, it's religion, it's politics, even international power dynamics. It's this big web, and to really understand it, you have to carefully untangle all of the threads.
A web of conflict. Okay, so let's rewind the clock way back to 1947. British India is being partitioned, and India and Pakistan are born. You'd think that would be a relatively straightforward process. But the region of Jammu and Kashmir throws a massive wrench into everything.
Yeah, the Maharaja of Kashmir, the ruler at the time, he actually initially wanted independence for the region. And this makes sense when you consider that Kashmir has actually been ruled by a whole series of empires.
Yeah.
So there was this kind of desire for autonomy there. But you can imagine the pressure he must have been under, independence joining India or joining Pakistan, a choice with enormous implications.
Absolutely. And ultimately, he makes the choice to join India. But instead of peace, this triggers the First Indo-Pakistani War in 1947.
Ending with that ceasefire line. But the core issue of Kashmir's ownership, it remained completely unresolved. And it kind of became and still is this wound that never quite healed and just keeps causing problems.
It's incredible to think that a decision made over 75 years ago still has such a ripple effect today, so things don't stay calm for long. In the 60s and 70s, the conflict flares up again, first in 1965, and then in 1971, leading to the creation of Bangladesh. Now, those wars are significant on their own, but there's this global context we need to consider here as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Cold War was in full swing. Both India and Pakistan were being courted by these superpowers. So you have each country trying to find their own path, all while being pulled in these different directions by these global forces, adding just this whole other layer of tension to the relationship.
And then in 1974, India tests its first nuclear weapon. And not to be outdone, Pakistan follows suit. So how did this change the nature of this conflict?
This was a major turning point because suddenly any confrontation carries this unimaginable risk of nuclear war. The stakes are raised exponentially, and the potential for absolute devastation becomes very real.
And that nuclear shadow hasn't faded, right? It still hangs over everything.
Every political decision, every military maneuver, every border skirmish is weighed against the potential for nuclear escalation. It's this really sobering reality that shapes every aspect of the conflict.
So let's zoom in on Kashmir, the heart of this conflict. In 1989, things take another turn when Pakistan begins supporting a resistance movement in Indian-ministered Kashmir. Now, this isn't just cheering from the sidelines, is it?
Much more active, providing training resources, logistical support to this movement. And the result, decades of violence and instability.
So it's not just ideological support. This is direct involvement that's contributing to the conflict. And then in 1999, the Kargil War erupts, which really highlights just how fragile peace can be.
Yeah, you can have ceasefires, you can have peace agreements, but those underlying tensions, that mistrust, those unresolved issues, they're still there simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. And even after another ceasefire is signed in 2003, the line of control remains incredibly volatile.
Now, the line of control, for those listening who maybe aren't familiar, is essentially the de facto border between the Indian and Pakistani-controlled parts of Kashmir. And that's where a lot of the tension and violence plays out. So even with the ceasefire in place, there are still regular exchanges of fire across the LOC. What does that say about the level of trust between these two nations?
It says the trust is incredibly fragile, almost non-existent. Each side is constantly on edge, just waiting for the other to make a move to break that fragile peace. A situation where even a small incident, even a misunderstanding, can quickly escalate into a larger confrontation. It's a pressure cooker situation, and sadly that pressure boils over in 2008 with the horrific Mumbai attacks. Over 160 people lost their lives, including 6 Americans. And the evidence really pointed towards a militant group based in Pakistan.
Yeah, the 2008 Mumbai attacks were a global wake-up call. Can you imagine the pressure the Indian government was under to retaliate? And remember, this wasn't just an attack on India. This was an attack on multiple nations. The global community was watching, holding its breath, waiting to see how India would respond.
And it's remarkable what they did. Instead of military action, they chose to focus on diplomacy, working with international partners to pressure Pakistan to take action against these perpetrators.
So even in the face of this horrific tragedy, there was this flicker of hope, this belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. A powerful example of restraint, and a testament to the desire for a more peaceful path, even amid such deep animosity.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what if things had escalated? Where would we be today?
That's a thought-provoking question. So fast forward to 2014, Narendra Modi becomes India's prime minister. And initially there was a sense of optimism, like maybe Modi with this strong mandate, maybe he could be the one to finally break this deadlock. But that optimism was short-lived, wasn't it?
Yeah, things took a dramatic turn in 2019 when India revoked Article 370 of its constitution. Now, this article granted special status to Jammu and Kashmir, giving it a degree of autonomy.
Okay, hold on. For those of us listening who might not be experts on Indian constitutional law, can you break down what revoking Article 370 actually meant for Kashmir and why it was so controversial?
Essentially, it meant that the Indian government would have more direct control over the region. They argued that it was necessary for security and for integration, but critics, both within India and internationally, saw it as a way to solidify control and really diminish Kashmiri autonomy.
And the international community, they were paying attention, right?
Absolutely. A lot of countries, even those with close ties to India, raised concerns about human rights. There were communication blackouts, restrictions on movement, and a real crackdown on dissent. It created a lot of tension on the world stage.
So we have this internal conflict playing out against a backdrop of all these shifting global dynamics. And then there's China, whose influence in the region is growing. They have this close relationship with Pakistan and their own border disputes with India. It feels like all these pieces are on a chessboard, constantly moving and creating a really unpredictable situation.
Yeah, that's a great way to visualize it. And you can't underestimate China's role in all of this. Their support for Pakistan, especially in terms of economic and military cooperation. It has really emboldened Pakistan. And at the same time, China's own territorial disputes with India mean that India is potentially facing conflict on two fronts.
Wow, a geopolitical pressure cooker. So looking at the last few years, 2020 to now, headlines have been filled with escalating tensions, border clashes, targeted killings, a real crackdown on independent media in Kashmir. It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
It does. That 2021 ceasefire agreement offered a brief respite, but it didn't really address the root causes of the conflict. And now with the 2024 Indian elections right around the corner, there's just so much uncertainty. The outcome of those elections could really shift the trajectory of this entire conflict.
You know, sometimes when we hear about conflicts in faraway places, it's easy to feel disconnected, but it's so important to remember that this isn't just some regional issue. The India-Pakistan conflict has global implications. We're talking about two nuclear-armed nations facing off. What would the consequences be if things really escalated?
That's a terrifying thought, but it's one that we can't ignore. A nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan wouldn't be contained to their borders. The fallout, both literally and figuratively, would be felt around the world. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe, an environmental disaster, and a blow to global security that we would struggle to recover from.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that this conflict, it's not just some historical curiosity or a political puzzle. This is a threat to global peace and stability. So you've shared a lot of information with us. What do you think are the key takeaways here? What's most important for us to understand about this conflict?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that this is not simply a territorial dispute. This is a deeply emotional conflict, rooted in history, identity, and national narratives. Both countries have really constructed their identities in relation to the other, often portraying themselves as victims and the other as the aggressor. So that makes finding common ground incredibly difficult.
Almost like they're trapped in this cycle of blame and resentment.
Exactly. And the second takeaway, I think, is that Kashmir isn't just a piece of land. It's a symbol of history, religion, identity for both India and Pakistan, which makes any kind of compromise incredibly difficult. It's not just about dividing territory, it's about dividing something much deeper.
And that third takeaway, the one that really keeps me up at night, is that nuclear dimension. We can't forget that these are two nuclear powers with a history of conflict. The potential for escalation is always there, lurking in the background. The stakes are incredibly high.
And a fourth, and perhaps the most important takeaway, is the human cost of this conflict. We often get caught up in the geopolitics, the military strategies, the nuclear threats, but at the heart of it all are people. The Kashmiris who have been living in a conflict zone for decades, the families who have been torn apart, the individuals who have lost loved ones to violence, and the millions who live with the constant fear of escalation.
You're right. It's so easy to get lost in all that abstract analysis and forget about the real people whose lives are being directly impacted. So, with all of that in mind, what does the future hold for India and Pakistan? Is there any hope for a lasting peace? Or are we destined to see this conflict continue to simmer with the threat of boiling over always present?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is.
And we've talked about a lot of the big picture stuff, the history, the politics, that nuclear threat, but what you said about the human cost really stuck with me. This report talks about increased violence along the line of control-targeted killings, a crackdown on independent media. What does that actually mean for everyday people living in Kashmir?
Well, it means living with this level of uncertainty and fear that's hard to imagine. Imagine living in a place where you're constantly worried about getting caught in the crossfire. Basic freedoms like speech and movement are restricted. Just expressing your opinion could be dangerous. That's the reality for many Kashmiris.
It's almost like living in an open-air prison. And it's not just physical safety that's at risk, right? I mean, this report also talks about psychological trauma, the long-term effects of witnessing violence, of constantly feeling threatened.
Yeah, the mental and emotional toll of living in a conflict zone is huge. Generations of Kashmiris have grown up under the shadow of this conflict, and the impact on their well-being is profound. You can't just erase decades of trauma and fear.
It really makes you wonder, what will it take to create a future where Kashmir is known for peace and not conflict? Is there even a path to get there?
That's the question everyone is asking.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think if we're looking for hope, it has to start with the Kashmiri people themselves. Any lasting solution has to come from within, from a dialogue that includes all stakeholders, a dialogue that truly addresses the grievances and aspirations of the Kashmiri people.
So true peace in Kashmir can't be imposed from the outside. It has to come from the people who are directly affected by this conflict.
Right. It's about creating a space where Kashmiris can determine their own future, where their voices are heard and their needs are met. And of course, this means both India and Pakistan will have to make some really difficult choices, re-examine some long-held assumptions, challenge these deeply ingrained narratives.
It sounds like that would take a level of trust and a willingness to compromise that's been incredibly elusive so far.
Yeah, it would be a monumental shift, but I believe it's the only path that leads to a genuine and lasting peace.
It's a powerful reminder that real peace building isn't just about treaties and ceasefires. It's about addressing the root causes of the conflict, healing those wounds of the past, and creating a future where everyone feels safe and respected.
And for those of us outside of this conflict, it's about staying informed, understanding the complexities, and pushing for solutions that prioritize peace and human rights above all else.
Well, after spending all this time really delving into the India-Pakistan conflict with you, I think it's clear that this is one of the most complex and challenging issues facing the world today. And for all of you listening out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on this conflict, one that goes beyond those headlines, and helps you understand the human stories at the heart of it all.
Yeah, and remember, this is an ongoing story. The search for understanding is a journey, and we encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with this critical topic. The future of peace, not just in the region, but potentially the world could depend on it.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.